Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the idea of an owned TBR. So I started thinking about this after watching a few different booktubers go through their owned TBR. I thought about it because these particular booktubers had a whole video on it and had a few hundred books in their collection that they'd never read. It made me think because I have never been in that sort of a situation. At first, there was a part of me is like, why are you just buying all of the books? Go to the library. And I realized I was being judgmental, so I wanted to sit with it and think about it and think about my own thoughts and philosophy when it comes to the TBR and purchasing books for my own personal library. Now, I've talked about in a vlog, I think, and you've seen this cart back here. This is a recent addition. This is my owned TBR cart. So you might be thinking, wait, you think it's bad to have books that you own that you haven't read yet, and yet you have a TBR cart? No, I don't think it's bad. It's just not something that I fundamentally do. And this is a recent addition for me, but it goes along with how I have operated for years. Now, not me as high school me or whatever. I would just buy the books, and I loved going to the bookstore and finding an author that I liked and getting the books and then reading them, and then I would hold on to them. Most of those books that I got when I was in high school, I no longer own because they were not great. But we learn, we grow, our reading tastes change. So that being said, as I delved more into minimalism, I went through a phase. I still don't get a lot of stuff, but as I delved into that, I started thinking about the books that I read. I went through a couple years where I made a challenge for myself to reread every book that I owned and decide whether or not I was going to keep it on my shelf. That helped me get rid of several hundred books. My collection went down from like 5 or 6 bookshelves to 2. My 2 big ones that I still have. Then from that point forward, I would not put a book onto my bookshelf unless I had already read it. And so if I got books that I hadn't read before, they would sit in another location until I read them. So like this right here, my TBR cart, these are books that I own, but I have not read yet. And I've gotten them for a variety of reasons. So this is what, for me, goes into getting a book that I have not read before if I'm going to spend money on it. I have talked before about how I want to increase my fluency in Spanish, and so I have started getting books in Spanish to add to my collection. And I will say for this summer, I would simply read the book when I was getting closer to the end. I had a list. I would purchase the next one on there, and then I would read it. Now what I've done is that list, I've just purchased all of those books, and they're out of frame, but it's this bottom shelf here. So take for instance this book, Se Fueron a la Izquierda. This is the Spanish version of a book that I just read recently, which I'll mention in a moment. And I knew because I'd already read The Girl in the Blue Coat and I'd read it in English and Spanish, that I wanted to have it in Spanish and have it available for my students in my classroom library, so I purchased it. I have not yet read it. That's the biggest amount of unread books that I have. So these are some. Typically they are books that I have either, for the most part, with the exception of maybe this one and a graphic novel version of Pride and Prejudice, they are books that I've read before. And I've read Pride and Prejudice before, just not the graphic novel version. So my books in Spanish I've read before in English. So there's one exception to my rule. The other exception to my rule are books on education. So sometimes I get these for free. So for example, this book right here, A Novel Approach, this was last year, I believe. The department chair in ELA gave copies of these to all of the ELA teachers. Now I don't teach ELA this year, but I didn't spend money on this book. Occasionally I will get these books and I won't have read them yet. And I sort of want to have a little bit of a library related to that. And so obviously included in that are textbooks if I take any graduate level classes for my career. So that's another exception. I still own a lot of books. At last count, it was over 450. Most people, they don't own that many books. But I can say with almost a certainty that, with the exception of my TBR cart, I have read every single book on my shelves. Since that's my philosophy, I don't put a book on my shelf until I've read it. You know, those go together. And another thing that keeps me from purchasing all the books before I read them is because I read a lot. I read a ridiculous amount of books. Like, for me to have a year where I barely make 100 books in a year, that was a tough reading year for me. What that also means is it would be prohibitively expensive for me to purchase every single book before I read it. Growing up as I did in a single parent household where we made quite frequent use of the library, I developed a fondness for the library. I still wholeheartedly support the library, and that's another reason why I get so many of my books from the library. It is such a crucial resource, and by using it to like check out the books and, you know, accidentally holding on to them a few days, so I'm giving them some money with some overdue fees, I am supporting my library and everything that they can provide. I can't speak in depth to this, but I would direct you to Ashley from Bookish Realm because she is a librarian and she speaks quite eloquently on this. For me, purchasing all the books before I read them has never made a lot of sense. Because I read so much. Reading, like this year, I want to read 21 books a month. That's like 250 books, and okay, yeah, I mean, I guess I could purchase all of them, especially if I went to secondhand shops or whatever. It just has never been what I typically do. So what drives me to actually purchase books? So first off, I am a collector. I absolutely love to collect things. So in my bookshelf tours that I have done, you see that I have a huge section and growing section of Harry Potter books. I've read all of those books. I have probably read them enough times to have read every book in that collection, but I have not read every physical book. Most of my books that I have that are, say, duplicates are collector's edition. I haven't counted how many of these that I have. I have this gorgeous Mina Lima edition that I've showed before. I have the Jim K illustrated edition in English and in Spanish. I have the US hardback. I have the US paperback. I'm looking up at my shelves to see. I have the Bloomsbury Ravenclaw edition in hardcover. I have the UK hardcover. And I have just, I think it's US version, but I got it so that I could use the Nerdy Ink covers. And I have the Armenian edition. So I can guarantee you I will never actually physically read this book because I do not know how to read Armenian. But it is special to me because I'm Armenian, and I really wish that they would publish the rest of the series so I could have a complete series. That's a collector's thing. And Harry Potter's not the only thing that I collect in. So I also collect the Barnes & Noble. This is one of the first videos that I filmed on this channel, was my haul of all these Barnes & Noble books. And I will admit, I have not read this physical book before. I have read probably a lot of the myths contained within this, but all of the other classics that I have on my shelf, I have read those except for the myth collections. So that's another thing that I collect. And then because I love Lord of the Rings so much, I have these books in English and Spanish collector's edition, plus this absolutely gorgeous one that I've shown before. So that's one reason that I purchase books, and that is for collecting purposes. On top of that, when I purchase books, I don't actually often reread them. One exception to that would be How the Word is Passed. So this is a book I've read this year, and I've talked about how much I absolutely loved it, and right now it's one of the top 2 books I've read this year. I read it on audiobook. I wanted to be able to own a physical copy of it so that I could annotate it. Now, I haven't done it yet. I'm either going to do it during spring break or during the summers when I can devote a lot of time and attention to it. But if I'm going to reread it, if I'm going to dig in, if I'm going to annotate on the book, I'm going to own it. But I don't reread a lot of them. So because I get the books from the library the first time, a lot of these particular editions that you see behind me, I have not physically read those editions. I've read the story, but that particular book, I did not sit down and flip through and read. So why would I own it? And I think it's the idea that each one of these represents an amazing reading experience. And it is so much fun for me to be able to just sometimes look at the books that I have on my shelves and think about the experience that I had while reading them. By me purchasing them, I am indicating something about like where my priorities are. What are the things that I value? I also love the idea of having information at my fingertips and being able to say recommend books. And the idea that because I have these books, I'm able to recommend them and spread that love to other people and have this information at my fingertips, be able to go back and find all of these things that I absolutely love. So that's one of the big reasons why I purchase books. There are a few exceptions, a handful of exceptions where I will purchase a book without having read it. So one of those exceptions for when I will purchase a book is the really big book sale. I always forget all the words that they have in there, that's held every August. And I still have 3 books on my owned TBR from that sale. And I always go on the last day of the sale when you can take a big bag, pay $10 and get as many books as you can put into that bag. And so I ended up with 19 books for $10. So some of the books went to my classroom library. So they were books that I knew were good books and I wanted to have for my students and I'd read them before. The ones that are still my own TBR, they are things that piqued my interest. Like maybe I've read something by that author before. For example, I have this copy of The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. It is by Doris Kearns Goodwin. She is one of my favorite historians. And I own a couple others like The Bully Pulpit and Team of Rivals. This is an older copy. I don't know when this was published, but it's by an author that I know and I'm getting it for basically like half a dollar. The other exception is there are a handful of authors where I know that I am likely to adore the book. And I don't do this often, but if I keep having success like what I had with They Went Left, which is another one of my top 10 books for the year, I might do it a little bit more often. Now, I had a vlog, my Christmas week vlog, where I went to Barnes & Noble and I came away with just 2 books, but these were the 2 books. The reason I got this one is because I have listened to the podcast that this is based on, and I know the scholarship of Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the author of this book, and I thought, oh, it's in written form. It's another one of those, I listened to it, I want it in written form. Now, it's a slightly different form than the podcast, but I'm like, okay, I think I want this. And then this one, again, for the same reason that I got this one and almost forgot that I had this one, I knew that I wanted this one and it did not disappoint. So I don't think that I will ever have a huge owned TBR. It makes things like my thumbnails for some of my videos a little bit awkward because not all the books are going to be in there because I want to return them before I owe $15 on a book that I thought was middling or something like that. Half of my stack out there for my March TBR, they're library books. That's the typical type of book that I read, and then eventually maybe I'll add it to my collection. So is there anything wrong with purchasing books that you haven't read? Absolutely not. I don't tend to pre-order, but I have already pre-ordered some. I read in December The Bone Shard Daughter and absolutely fell in love with it and knew that I wanted to read The Bone Shard Emperor as soon as it came out. So I purchased it. That is on my TBR for this month, February. So hopefully I will get to it by the time this video goes up. I have also actually, I might regret it, I don't know. I have already pre-ordered book 3, The Bone Shard War, in this series because so many of the reviewers that I have seen, like I read the first one and loved it. And I know a lot of other reviewers who also loved the first one, loved the second one. I'm like, okay, well, if you love the first and the second, well, then I want the complete thing. I have pre-ordered a couple others. I'm going to pre-order the Jim Kay illustrated 5th Harry Potter book just because it's a collector's item. I have pre-ordered the Tristan Strong graphic novel, but in that case, I've read the first book. I've read that book and I know that it's amazing. So I just want the graphic novel version of it. So I will pre-order occasionally. I do tend to prefer to get the books from my library, to access them, and if I love them, then it's a sign of affection for me to bring those books into my library. Is there a good way of doing that? Is there a bad way of doing that? Is having a huge owned TBR, which this is not, is having a huge owned TBR a bad thing? No. Is relying on the library for just about everything a bad thing? No. I think with this video, I just wanted to explore my own philosophy behind the books that I have purchased, the books that I have in my library, how I incorporate that into my life. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.